Smash the like button if you're ready to step into the darkest corners of the justice system. Subscribe if you want stories they don't teach in school. And comment right now, before this gets heavy, do you believe monsters are born or made? Welcome back. Tonight, you're not just watching a crime story. You're stepping into a place most people only see in headlines and mugshots. A place where labels are easier than answers, and where one man became a symbol so terrifying that nobody bothered to ask who he actually was. Because this story isn't about proving innocence. It's about what happens when the world decides you're beyond understanding. The sirens tore through the California night like a warning meant for the entire city. Red and blue lights bounced off storefront windows, alleyway puddles, the chrome of parked cars. Police cruisers screamed down the street in tight formation, engines pushed to the edge, radios crackling with overlapping voices. Somewhere ahead, a man was running, not just from the police, but from a moment he could never undo. When officers finally cornered him near the edge of an industrial lot, the scene was chaos. Guns drawn, shouts cutting through the air, hands raised, shaking. A suspect pinned to the asphalt as cameras from news vans rolled in, capturing the image that would soon define him forever. By sunrise, the headlines had already decided his identity. Cold-blooded killer arrested. Monster behind brutal crime. Evil has a face. The victim's name spread quickly, accompanied by photographs pulled from social media. Smiling, human, loved. Candlelight vigils appeared overnight. Politicians promised justice. Commentators demanded the harshest punishment available. There was no room for nuance. There never is at the beginning. By the time the suspect's name was spoken on television, it wasn't a name anymore. It was a warning. The courtroom was packed on the first day of the trial. Reporters filled the front rows. Victims' relatives clutched tissues and photographs, their grief raw and visible. The accused sat motionless at the defense table, flanked by attorneys who knew the odds were already stacked against them. Prosecutors painted a simple picture. A violent man. A senseless act. A clear line between good and evil. They showed graphic evidence, played emotional testimony, and used language designed not just to convince, but to harden hearts. The jury watched, silent and pale. Outside, protesters held signs demanding death. When the verdict came back guilty, it felt inevitable. When the sentence was read, death row, some people cried. Others nodded in grim satisfaction. Justice, they believed, had been served. And just like that, the man was sent to San Quentin State Prison. San Quentin sits on the edge of the San Francisco Bay, its gray walls rising out of the fog like something permanent and unmovable. For more than a century, it has been the final stop for California's most infamous criminals. Its name alone carries weight, fear, finality, and the promise that whatever happens inside, the outside world won't have to deal with it anymore. When the transport bus rolled through the gates, guards weren't thinking about headlines or morality. They were thinking about procedure. Chains clinked. Doors slammed. A number replaced a name. Death row is quieter than people expect. No screaming. No cinematic chaos. Just concrete, steel, and time stretching endlessly forward. Cells the size of bathrooms. Lights that never truly go dark. The slow erosion of identity. To the public, everyone on death row is the same. Monsters. Irredeemable. Easier not to imagine as human. But inside San Quentin, something strange began to happen. Correctional officers, men and women who had spent decades around violence, noticed it first. The inmate didn't posture. He didn't threaten. He didn't explode in rage the way many others did. He followed rules. He spoke softly. He listened. One guard later said quietly, he didn't act like the guy from the headlines. Counselors noticed it too. During mandatory evaluations, he didn't minimize the crime. He didn't deflect blame. When asked about the victim, he didn't complain about his own suffering. He talked about guilt, heavy, suffocating guilt, and about a moment he wished he could rewind forever. That didn't make him innocent. It didn't undo the damage. But it complicated the story. Then came the letters. At first, they were standard, legal correspondence, formal notes. But over time, handwritten letters began arriving from unexpected places. A former teacher, a childhood neighbor, even, controversially, a distant relative of the victim who wrote not to forgive, but to ask questions. How did this happen? Who were you before this? Were you always what they say you are? Inside the prison, the man answered carefully. Not defensively. Not theatrically. He wrote about growing up in instability, about untreated mental health struggles, about choices that escalated when no one was paying attention. He never excused the crime. He never asked for sympathy. He asked for understanding. That distinction mattered more than anyone realized. Meanwhile, outside the prison walls, the narrative stayed frozen in time. News segments reused the same booking photo. True crime shows reduced the case to a few shocking details. Online comments called for his execution to be broadcast publicly. Dehumanization is efficient. It saves time. It saves emotion. But inside San Quentin, the cracks in the myth widened. A volunteer chaplain would later recall a moment that unsettled her deeply. During a group session, another inmate broke down, sobbing uncontrollably. Before staff could intervene, the so-called monster stood up, wrapped his shackled hands as best he could around the man's shoulders, and whispered something no one else could hear. The crying stopped. The room went silent. No one spoke about it afterward. There was no place in the official narrative for moments like that. As years passed, appeals came and went. Dates were set, delayed, suspended. Life on death row became an endless waiting room between existence and erasure. And still, the man remained inconsistent with the legend built around him. That inconsistency began to disturb people, especially when a retired investigator, reviewing old case files for an unrelated project, noticed something off. Not enough to overturn a conviction. Not enough to declare a miscarriage of justice. But enough to raise a question no one wanted to ask. A piece of evidence that had been accepted without challenge. A timeline that relied heavily on a single witness. A detail that didn't quite align with the certainty everyone had embraced. The investigator requested access to additional records. Inside a locked evidence room, beneath layers of dust and forgotten paperwork, he found a box that hadn't been opened in years. And inside that box was something that didn't fit the story the world had already decided was complete. Because if this man was exactly who the headlines said he was, then this evidence should not exist. And if it did exist, what else had been simplified, ignored, or erased along the way? That question would not only threaten a conviction, it would threaten the comfort of believing that evil is always obvious. And once that belief cracks, there's no putting it back together. If you think you know where this story is going, stay right here. Because what they uncovered next didn't just change the case. It changed how everyone involved saw punishment, guilt, and the cost of turning people into monsters. And the truth waiting inside San Quentin was far more unsettling than anyone expected. If you're still watching, you're already deeper than most people ever go. Hit like if you believe the truth is never simple. Subscribe right now if you want crime stories that don't end where the headlines stop. And pause for 1 second. Comment below, should understanding a criminal ever matter after a conviction? Your answer might change how you hear the rest of this story. The evidence box smelled like dust and old paper, the kind of smell that clings to rooms no one visits anymore. The retired investigator stood alone under flickering fluorescent lights, turning over folders that had been stamped, signed, and forgotten decades earlier. This wasn't some dramatic last-minute discovery. No alarms. No gasps. Just a quiet realization that something small had been accepted too easily. Inside the box was a witness statement that never made it to the jury. Not because it was hidden maliciously. Not because of a conspiracy. But because it was inconvenient. The witness had been dismissed early in the investigation, labeled unreliable, inconsistent, emotional. Yet reading the transcript now, the investigator felt a slow tightening in his chest. The timeline described didn't align with the prosecution's version. The suspect's movements overlapped in a way that shouldn't have been possible. It didn't prove innocence, but it shattered certainty. He closed the box and sat down, suddenly aware of the weight of the room. Careers had been built on this case. Elections won. Promotions earned. Entire narratives constructed on the idea that the right man was behind bars, and that justice had been clean and decisive. Certainty is comforting. Doubt is dangerous. When the investigator reached out to the defense team, now long disbanded, he expected resistance. Instead, he found exhaustion. Lawyers who had once fought passionately now spoke with caution, careful not to reopen wounds they no longer had the power to heal. One of them said something that stuck. "We stopped asking questions because no one wanted answers anymore." Back inside San Quentin, the man on death row had no idea any of this was happening. His days followed a rigid rhythm. Count again. Time measured not in hours but in routines. He had learned to keep his expectations low. Appeals taught him one lesson repeatedly: hope is fragile, and disappointment lasts longer. When a counselor mentioned that someone wanted to speak with him, an investigator, not a lawyer, he assumed it was another evaluation, another box to check. He was wrong. The meeting took place in a narrow room separated by thick glass. The investigator didn't start with promises. He didn't offer hope. He simply asked questions. "Walk me through that night again." The man closed his eyes before answering. Not for drama. For survival. He had replayed that night thousands of times, each version ending the same way, with regret that never softened. As he spoke, something unexpected happened. The investigator listened. Not to trap. Not to interrupt. Just listened. Details emerged that hadn't been emphasized at trial. Moments of hesitation. Confusion. A choice that seemed small at the time but spiraled beyond control. He didn't shift blame. He didn't ask for mercy. At one point he stopped talking. "You still think I did it?" he said quietly. The investigator nodded. Yes. There was no anger in the response. Only relief. Because for the first time in years, someone was seeing him as more than a caricature of evil. That meeting changed the trajectory of the case, not legally yet, but psychologically. Word spread among staff. Among volunteers. Even among other inmates. Something was happening, and it didn't fit the usual script. Then the unthinkable occurred. A victims' advocacy group requested access to prison records related to inmate behavior programs. They were researching rehabilitation, responsibility, and the impact of accountability behind bars. The man's name appeared repeatedly, not as a success story, but as a data point. Consistent behavior. No infractions. Participation in restorative justice discussions, where inmates are required to confront the human cost of their actions. One member of the group, whose own family had been shattered by violent crime, insisted on meeting him. The prison administration hesitated. This was not standard. Emotions could escalate. Lawsuits could follow. But the meeting was approved. The room was tense. Guards positioned carefully. The air thick with anticipation. When the victim's advocate sat down across from him, she didn't offer forgiveness. She didn't smile. She asked one question. "Do you understand what you took?" The man's answer was quiet, steady, and devastating. "Yes. And I live with it every day." No excuses. No tears. Just acknowledgement. Afterward, the advocate left without comment. Weeks later, she submitted a written statement, not supporting release, not opposing the sentence, but questioning the usefulness of reducing people to monsters. "If we pretend they are inhuman," she wrote, "we never have to confront how human failures create these tragedies." That statement reached the media, and the reaction was explosive. Talk shows erupted. Comment sections burned. People accused her of betrayal, weakness, even cruelty toward victims. Others admitted, reluctantly, that the idea unsettled them in ways they didn't expect. Here's where you come in. Drop a comment right now and tell me honestly, can society handle complexity, or do we need villains to feel safe? I'm reading these, and your perspective shapes what stories we tell next. As attention returned to the case, journalists dug deeper. Old witnesses were re-interviewed. One recanted part of their testimony, not the core facts, but the confidence with which they had spoken. Another admitted they had been pressured to be more certain than they actually were. Still, none of this erased guilt. And that was the paradox at the heart of it all. The man on death row was responsible. A life was lost because of him. Nothing could change that. But responsibility didn't require simplification. And punishment didn't have to rely on dehumanization. As public debate intensified, something darker surfaced. An anonymous tip arrived at a local newsroom. It claimed that another individual connected to the original crime had been quietly investigated years earlier and cleared without much explanation. The name matched a person briefly mentioned in early police notes, then never again. When reporters followed the lead, doors closed quickly. Records sealed. Calls unreturned. Silence. Inside San Quentin, the man learned about the renewed attention through a guard who slipped up during casual conversation. "They're talking about your case again," the guard said. On the outside. That night, the man didn't sleep. Not because he expected freedom, but because he feared something worse, the truth being twisted into something it wasn't. He had spent years accepting his fate. What unsettled him now was the possibility that the story would be rewritten into something dishonest. And that fear was justified. Because as journalists closed in on the unnamed figure from the early investigation, they uncovered a connection that had never been made public. A relationship. A motive. A reason that had been buried beneath urgency and outrage. A reason that complicated everything. When the documents finally surfaced, one line stood out, highlighted, underlined, ignored for decades. Subject present at scene earlier than previously stated. That single sentence didn't free anyone. But it cracked the foundation of the case wide open. And once the foundation cracks, the entire structure becomes unstable. If this chapter is making you uncomfortable, good. That's where real crime stories live. Make sure you're subscribed, because Chapter 3 doesn't just ask who deserves punishment, it asks who benefits from certainty. And when the final truth comes out, you'll understand why some stories are buried not because they're false, but because they're too hard to face. Before we go any further, if you've stayed with this story until now, you're not a casual viewer anymore. Hit the like button if you believe the hardest truths are the ones worth facing. Subscribe if you want real crime stories that don't flinch when things get uncomfortable. And comment right now, should the justice system care more about certainty or truth, even when truth complicates everything? Your answer matters more than you think. The documents didn't arrive all at once. They came in fragments, leaks, court filings, forgotten memos scanned late at night by journalists who understood exactly how fragile this moment was. One wrong headline, one careless word, and the entire conversation would collapse back into outrage and denial. But when the pieces were finally laid side by side, a pattern emerged. The unnamed individual from the early investigation wasn't just a peripheral figure. He had been closer to the victim than the prosecution ever acknowledged. He had motive, not speculative, not theoretical, but documented. Financial strain. Personal conflict. A volatile history that had been softened in official summaries. Most damning of all, he had been present near the scene earlier than originally stated. That didn't absolve the man on death row. The crime still happened. His actions still mattered. But the story the public had been told, the clean, singular narrative of evil, was no longer intact. Inside San Quentin, the atmosphere shifted. Guards who had once treated the man like a fixed point, unchanging, final, now watched him with a different kind of awareness. Not sympathy. Not forgiveness. Recognition. The understanding that certainty had been premature. The man himself didn't celebrate. There was no sense of victory. When his attorney, newly appointed, cautiously optimistic, explained the implications, he listened without interruption. "So they might say it wasn't just me," he said. "Yes," the attorney replied. "They might." He nodded slowly. "It still ends the same for them." The them wasn't prosecutors or the state. It was the victim's family. Because complexity doesn't heal grief. It complicates it. When the family was informed that new information had surfaced, reactions varied. One relative refused to hear it, calling it a distraction. Another demanded every document, every transcript, desperate to understand how so many people could have been so sure for so long. A private meeting was arranged. No cameras. No press. Just a small room, a table, and years of unresolved pain. The man entered in restraints, his movements measured. He didn't look at them at first. When he finally did, his voice shook, not with fear, but with the weight of what could never be repaired. "I'm not here to change what you feel about me," he said. "I just want you to know. I know what I took. And I don't expect anything back." One family member stood up and left. Another stayed seated, staring at the table, fists clenched. After the meeting, no statements were released. No closure was announced. Real life rarely provides that. But something shifted anyway. Outside the prison, legal motions were filed. Not to overturn the conviction, but to reassess the sentence. The argument was narrow, careful, and controversial. It claimed that the jury had been denied a full picture of responsibility, context, and mitigating factors, not excuses, but understanding. Public reaction was immediate and brutal. Radio hosts mocked the idea. Online forums erupted. Politicians distanced themselves. No one wanted to be associated with softness in a case once defined by moral clarity. But clarity, it turned out, had been an illusion. The hearing was scheduled quietly, almost reluctantly. The courtroom wasn't packed this time. No protest signs. No chanting crowds. Just legal professionals, family members, and a handful of observers who understood the significance of what was happening. The judge listened. Testimony was presented. Not emotional appeals, but records. Missed opportunities. Assumptions baked into procedure. Language used to simplify what should have been examined more carefully. When the judge spoke, the room went silent. "This court is not tasked with forgiveness," he said, "nor with rewriting history. It is tasked with fairness." The ruling did not free the man. Instead, it did something far more unsettling. The death sentence was vacated. Life without the possibility of parole replaced it. For some, this felt like justice correcting itself. For others, it felt like betrayal. The man was transferred out of death row within weeks. Walking through the prison corridors without the shadow of execution hanging over him felt unreal. He described it later as surviving an earthquake. Everything familiar was gone, but nothing felt stable yet. Inside general population, reactions were mixed. Some inmates respected him. Others resented the attention. He kept his head down, continued counseling, continued writing letters that were never guaranteed to be read. Years passed. The media moved on. New cases replaced old outrage. The story faded from headlines, surviving only in legal journals and quiet conversations about reform. Then, something happened that almost no one noticed. A young correctional officer, new to the job, still idealistic, requested a transfer after working closely with the man. In her exit interview, she wrote something that would later circulate quietly among staff. "I realized I was relying on labels to feel safe. When those labels stopped working, I had to confront my own assumptions." That sentence became a footnote in a much larger story. Because the real impact of this case wasn't legal. It was psychological. It forced people, guards, victims, viewers like you, to sit with an uncomfortable truth. Understanding someone does not erase what they've done. But refusing to understand makes cruelty easier to justify. And cruelty, when institutionalized, spreads. The man will die in prison. That part never changed. There was no dramatic release. No triumphant ending. Just time, accountability, and the slow passage of days. But the myth died with the death sentence. The monster everyone thought they knew never actually existed. What existed instead was something far more disturbing. A human being capable of terrible harm, and also capable of reflection, responsibility, and remorse. And if that makes you uneasy, that's the point. Because when we rely on monsters to explain violence, we never have to ask how systems fail, how warning signs are missed, or how ordinary human flaws escalate into irreversible tragedy. Before this video ends, do me one thing. Comment below, did this story change how you think about punishment even a little? Subscribe if you're ready for crime stories that don't give you easy answers. And like this video so more people are forced to sit with questions we usually avoid. They thought justice meant certainty. But certainty was the most dangerous lie of all. And if you think this story was intense, trust me, The next one will challenge you even more.